Good evening and welcome back to a conversation that we could have. And today I wanted to focus a little bit on the definition of Islamophobia. Uh, Defining Islamophobia has been at the center of conversations, debate, discussions, both individuals who are attempting to affirm the phenomena of Islamophobia, while others who are engaged in distractions for the most part, attempting to discount the whole phenomena. So I wanted to spend a few minutes, possibly with you, and feel free to comment uh, as I begin on any of the concepts that I am sharing with you. Now, when we define Islamophobia, attempt to define it, somebody throws that this is an irrational fear, and I do have a rational fear of Islam. Some, again, might engage in understanding Islamophobia as a form of bigotry toward Muslims. Others will say it's reactions to increased immigration and xenophobia in relations to Europe and possibly the United States. Others will say it just comes out of ignorance about Islam. And lastly, often, this is actually a response to terrorism. And you'll find both Muslims who say that Muslim actions is basically generating this hostilities and this Islamophobic response. So again, I'm not gonna deal with each one of these, but just to know that this is actually in the mix, as well as other statements that we possibly sometimes see. But how do we explain the rising tide of neo-Nazi groups, ultra-nationalist and populist, right-wing populist groups that are using Islamophobia to drive their political, at least interest, and drive people to the ballot box, whether here in the United States, in the UK, or increasingly in India with the PGP party, and other places as well. Also, recently we had the ban on the niqab in Switzerland, even though the less than 20 women across Switzerland that actually wear the niqab, but nevertheless, this was a rallying point that ended up in banning the niqab. And this came on the heel in a few years back, where there actually is a ban on minarets, the building of minarets in mosque in Switzerland. A similar type of ban on the niqab has been instituted in France, as well as in Quebec, in French-speaking part of Canada. Similarly, right now in France, there's a whole campaign to impose further restrictions on Muslims under the guise of actually trying to counter rising of Islamism, or what is called separatism. So we're for sure dealing with a phenomenon, meaning Islamophobia, that is no longer confined to one geography, one area, or one region. And the responses that we are seeing describe a complex, multi-faceted phenomena. So how to define and understand the crisis that we are seeing, which is the crisis of Islamophobia, and how to understand it. First, in terms of the term itself, contrary to possibly what you see written in some right-wing publications, also publications that are dismissive of the term, try to say that it was just recently developed. In reality, the first entry of this term, Islamophobia, emerges in French around the period of 1910, using the term Islamophobie. And it was translated at the time as feelings inimical to Islam, meaning in the French context, feelings inimical to Islam. Now, we need to understand that the French colonial interest and entanglement with the Muslim world was long in standing, so it wasn't a new phenomenon. So to say that the French didn't know about Islam or they had an ignorance about Islam, that notion has to be set aside. Rather, it was describing a set of practices that were directed at the Muslim population, in particular in North Africa and also parts of sub-Saharan Africa during the colonial period. So in this sense, these practices have otherwise demonized and treated Muslims in a distinctive subhuman way, in essence, to say it's a feelings inimical to Islam in relations to the treatment. So we need to look at colonial discourses in this sense in the French context, that the term appears in the entanglement of the French state with its colonial project in parts of the Muslim world, particularly North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. Therefore, anyone that has dealt with race theory and the links between race theory and colonization and racism, you reference Frantz Fanon, both The Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Mask, because again, Fanon's writings were undertaken in Algeria during the French colonial period in the country. So not only that we have Islamophobia appearing in French first, but also we see the writing relative to Frantz Fanon in terms of critiquing as well as writing about the treatment of Muslims as well as the subjects in the global south appearing in his work. So even though Fanon did not use the term Islamophobia or Islamophobia in his writing, one could read much of what he was writing in terms of the critique of the colonial project, both in terms of the treatment, also the psychological impact. We could see it in a very clear way in Frantz Fanon's writing at the time. So that's a very important and significant link. From feeling inimical to Islam, we get into Edward Said, who actually reintroduces the term in passing without really a considerable writing about it. And in essence, he looked at it as being hostility to Islam in the modern Christian world. So again, Edward Said, writing at the time during the late 70s, early 80s, 1970s, early 80s, writing his book Orientalism, covering Islam, the question of Palestine, and a host of other works. So he introduces the term or introduces the term specifically after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which also witnessed the famous Rushdie affairs that brought about a different notion of hostilities toward Islam. So again, Edward Said's writing about covering Islam came as a direct result of the coverage of Islam and the Muslims post-Iranian Revolution. So Edward Said, in covering Islam, exposes misperception of Islam and shows how partial media coverage usually finds what it wants rather than what is there. So in essence, he was one of the early individuals to begin to look at the whole field of representation, and his work on Orientalism deal with the subject systematically. So again, Edward Said reintroduced the term Islamophobia in his writing. So rather than to think of the term Islamophobia to be born out of the events of 9/11 or terrorism, this has to be again challenged and set aside. Rather, I think it points to the ignorance of individuals like Sam Harris and others who often are very, what you call, apt at throwing these one-liners or quick statements as a way of not wanting to deal with the substance of what is have taken place in relations to Islam and Muslims. And similarly, also we could mention Bill Maher, who often also uses Islamophobic terminology in his show, getting cheap laughs on a regular basis on his HBO and others. So it's a phenomenon not only to the right, but also you find it in the center left and in between. So again, Edward Said responding to events of the Iranian Revolution and the coverage focusing on Islam at the time. In the context of the UK, in the UK, the first known use of the word in print occurred in a book review in the Independent on the 16th of December 1991, reprinted in Tariq Madood, a dear friend in UK. He noted there is a view that the satanic verses was a deliberate mercenary act of Islamophobia, but indicated that his own view was that while Islamophobia is certainly at work, the real sickness is militant irreverence. So again, he introduced the term within the UK context and appears in the literature, being a person that introduced it in relations or in conversation and debate relative to the satanic verses. If we look at Islamophobia in the US context, without using the term itself, the Iranian hostage taking, which lasted 444 days, really shaped and the media mined historical sources in order to create a demonized perception and a demonized perspective relative to the coverage of Islam and Muslims. And the hostage crisis was a critical part of America's history. It impacted the presidency of Jimmy Carter, and also possibly was a major cause for Ronald Reagan winning the White House in 1980. And in this sense, Ted Koppel, who really began to anchor the NBC the NBC program Nightline, that began as a result of the coverage specifically of the hostage crisis, beginning each night with day 1, day 2, and so on until day 44. So Ted Koppel's career in terms of news coverage and in terms of becoming a major figure within the ABC landscape is directly connected to the Iranian hostage crisis and the coverage that were focused in there, resulting in a prolonged systematic engagement with the Muslim subject as a field of news and news coverage, which often really presented considerable negativity, even though that the hostilities between Iran and the United States was already negative. The media coverage actually almost intensified because it driven news intensively around this particular subject, and we are still, as you know, at this point entangled with what to do with the Iranian policy. So we have a long history of that part of the engagement. More importantly is that we do admit that the term itself is imperfect, meaning that Islamophobia, like many of the terms that emerge, are an imperfect term. It's definitely Islam and phobia being emerging together. And there are other people that offer a host of terms to try to deal with what they consider is the phenomena that needs to be documented. So in essence, a debate about what is the best term, I would say it's a waste of time and energy at this point, that the term is imperfect, but it's how you mobilize and how you define and quantify what is being looked upon is very critical and important in this sense. Terms in general are imperfection that results and are born of a certain historical developments, Islamophobia being one, in the same way that anti-Semitism as a term emerges as a part of a historical phenomena. Definitely, the individuals are who express their anti-Semitism are not looking at the linguistic structure and trying to debate that the term itself refers to a group of languages. We understand anti-Semitism as it results of its understanding and its definition, even though that there is debate as it relates to Israel. We understand it to be expressing hostilities and demonization of Jews as Jews, and trying to institute policies that marginalize them and, in essence, causing their death, as we see both in the medieval periods with pogroms and hostilities and violence, all the way up to the Holocaust, with the systematic genocide that was committed against the Jewish population. But no one sits down and begins to try to decipher and critique that the term Semite means an individual who speaks a cluster of Semitic languages. And therefore, individuals who, let's say, the neo-Nazis or the Nazis, they are not the grammarians that are opposing the Jews on a grammatical terminologies because they favor Western languages versus Semitic languages. So my point in here is that individuals who try to distract on the imperfection of the term, trying in a sense to dismiss the racism, discrimination, and bigotry that are directed at the Muslims. And in essence, if the understanding that all of a sudden you're going to find in the perfect term, and the perfect term is going to resolve the issue of hostilities, demonization, discrimination toward Muslims. So we know that there is a number of clusters of terms that are in use, but individuals who have a difficulty swallowing Islamophobia, I'm always welcome you. If you want to be called bigot, that's always in circulation. So I would not be what you call upset if you would prefer to be called bigoted against Muslims, if you would rather to be calling racism against Muslims, if you want to be a variety of terms to describe the phenomena that is there. So again, there is a cluster of terms that are in circulation, but my own understanding in terms of research and scholarship, that the debate about the term is already past, that has already been adopted, and it's incorporated way back from the early period of the Rumi Trust report that was issued in 1997 that looked at Islamophobia, a challenge for us all, that was looking at the British context, and have adopted a set of definitions as well, creating a visual map of what they mean with Islamophobia. The Rumi Trust report, in terms as being the first to enter into public policy circulation, the commission that was set up is to counter Islamophobic assumptions that Islam is a single monolithic system without internal development, diversity, and dialogue. And second, or B, to draw attention to the principal dangers which Islamophobia creates or exacerbates for Muslim communities, and therefore for the well-being of society as a whole. So those were the two major goals of the commission that was set up. It was set up following a commission that was looking at the problem of anti-Semitism and the challenge of anti-Semitism. So the Islamophobia was seen as linked or as a continuation of discussions about the problem of anti-Semitism. The Rumi Trust report defined Islamophobia as an outlook or worldview involving unfounded dread and dislike of Muslims, which results in practices of exclusion and discrimination. So again, an outlook or worldview of involving an unfounded dread and dislike of Muslims, which results in practices of exclusion and discrimination. This is very important. Again, we'll look into this because often you have what you call these sophisticated racists, and I don't want to call them sophisticated, this implies that there's some credit to them. They assume, well, I need to express my point of view and critique Islam. Or often they say, well, what about Saudi Arabia? And I often say, what about Saudi Arabia? Why don't you ask Bush, Cheney, and the rest of US presidents who are far closer to the Saudi royal family, or United Arab Emirates, or the whole host of these countries that buy our weapons, that we train their military, and we facilitate all their policies. But when we critique your treatment of Muslims in America as Muslim citizens, you actually create what I call a red herring. You point to an external country as if the person who's in San Francisco or in Washington, North Carolina, or Chicago, as if they are a citizen of Saudi Arabia. This is precisely what Islamophobia is. When you are asked about your treatment of your neighbor, or the person who owns a grocery store, or the taxi driver, or whoever, or even a doctor that is attending you that happen to be Muslim, and you treat them in an Islamophobic way, and the response from you is, again, look what they do in Saudi Arabia. Well, that question itself is insulting to begin with, but also it points to this nature of Islamophobia that is deployed constantly, that otherwise and externalize the Muslims. In essence, to say that they don't belong in here, that they're not really part of our society. So that's a very important point, because you see it time and time again, individuals that say, well, I don't hate Muslims, I am not Islamophobic, I just have a critique of Islam, right? But their critique of Islam immediately moves from, again, critiquing any aspect of Islam to critiquing individuals and critiquing the individual cultural and ability to practice their own identity in a free way within a society that is founded upon religious freedom and individual freedom. So if you have the right to walk down the street, let's say in Berkeley, without having any garment on you, the Muslim have the right to put as much garment as they want. But it seems that the Islamophobe who assert this want to have it both ways. On the one hand, asserting individual freedom, democracy, and so on, while at the same time they want to restrict the Muslims in terms of their practices. So this is a phenomena that we constantly see and realize relative to what the Islamophobes actually push forth on a regular basis. Nathan Lean, the author of the Islamophobia Industry, defined the term Islamophobia, describe prejudices and hostilities toward Muslims, not an irrational fear. So we're not dealing with an irrational fear, right? Somebody that goes and pull a hijab of a woman walking down the street is not an irrational fear. They're actually acting prejudices and hostilities. Interestingly enough, almost 80 to 85% of all the violent attacks targeting Muslim target Muslim women. Yet we often see silence, absolute silence from individuals that should be in the forefront of defending women's rights in general, but when it comes to a Muslim, that is not actually practiced. Oxford Dictionary define Islamophobia: intense dislike or fear of Islam, especially as a political force, hostility or prejudice toward Muslims. So again, this is the emergence of the term within the Oxford Dictionary. Gallup also introduced used a definition saying an exaggerated fear, assuming that there is some legitimate fears. Again, if somebody is threatening you, there is some legitimate fear in there, but an exaggerated fear, hatred, and hostilities toward Islam and Muslim that is perpetuated by negative stereotypes resulting in bias, discrimination, and the marginalization and exclusion of Muslims from social and civic life. So this is how the Gallup, in terms of their work relative to Islamophobia and polling Muslims as well as the American public on attitude toward Islam and Muslims. Interestingly enough, the work of Chris Allen in the UK School of Social Policy, College of Social Sciences at the University of Birmingham, took the definition that often is used relative to anti-Semitism and mirror it in relations to the Muslim. So he said Islamophobia is a certain perception of Muslims, which may be expressed as hatred toward Muslims. Rhetorical and physical manifestation of Islamophobia are directed toward Muslim or non-Muslim individuals and or their property, toward Muslim community institutions and religious facilities. So in essence, you could, if you look at how the Jewish subjects, again, in the 20th century, in the past period, the 20th century, as well as the 18th, 19th century, you could see that this is actually applicable relative to the treatment of Muslims. In Europe, the notion of the Jewish question was one of the most racist framing relative to the treatment of the Jews in Europe. And today, Europe and also parts of the United States, you could speak about New Zealand, Australia, and others, we are dealing with the Muslim question. Meaning the Muslim question is the racist question that otherizes and sees the Muslim as not belonging to the geography, to the state, to the territory that they are in, and they need to be treated in a distinctive, differentiated way, which is the essence of what discrimination is all about. So Islamophobia is about, again, treating Muslims differently, and this difference engages a variety of policies: securitization, surveillance, giving them a differentiated treatment, hostile discrimination in employment. All these issues are under the cluster and the rubric of what Islamophobia is all about. Now, more importantly, the United Nations Special Rapporteur actually also have included a definition of Islamophobia as well, which means that at the global institutional level, we have an adoption of a definition that relates to how the United Nations as an institution looks at the phenomena. So it's a baseless hostility and fear vis-a-vis Islam, and as a result, a fear of and aversion toward all Muslims or the majority of them. So Islamophobia also refers to the practical consequences of these hostilities in terms of discrimination, prejudices, and unequal treatment of which Muslims, individuals, and communities are victims, and their exclusion from major political and social spheres. So again, this points to the United Nations level, and they just recently reissued another report that specifically also documents and looks at the phenomena that we call Islamophobia with an operable definition that they're operating. Coming back to the Rumi Trust, which is really very important, it actually created for us a visual summary of what we call Islamophobia. It speaks of prejudice, discrimination, exclusion, and violence. So in essence, it looks at all these different arenas of how Islamophobia is expressed. So whether at the university level, at school, or the public discourse, if a person is saying, well, I just want to talk about Islam because I feel that Muslims in Saudi Arabia are against or anti-West, that has nothing to do with Islamophobia as it relates to a Muslim who is in the classroom, at a college, at a classroom in high school, at a corporate office working, or in any other setting. This is precisely what we are speaking about when we speak about all these issues in terms of the prejudices that are expressed, discrimination in employment, discrimination in healthcare provisions, discrimination that articulates itself in education. And I encourage people, just think about all your educational experiences in college, in school, as well as your immediate surrounding, and think about the considerable negative material and substance that often are introduced relative to Islam and Muslims in distinction to a general treatment of others. And here, without saying that other communities, especially, we are facing a high tide of anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian sentiment as a result both of COVID-19, which is again the pandemic, but the pandemic of political elites that find it opportune time to push anti-Asian sentiment, anti-Chinese sentiment as a way to center themselves and really not to be taken or held responsible for whatever consequences we are facing today. So again, this is a visual mapping that the Rumi Trust have put forth as early as 1997, but I think it still have a utility in looking at the various spheres in there. Some of our colleagues in the UK, Salman Sayed in Leeds, also have developed a project that looks at some of these clusters and how to examine them and quantify them as well, and to get a how to measure. Jasmine Zain, Professor Jasmine Zain in Canada, in Toronto, Canada, is also working in that context. So there are a number of researchers that are working to in a variety of ways to introduce and examine the phenomena that we call Islamophobia. There are critics, and I've been pointing to the critics of Islamophobia, so I'm not going to belabor this point further. There is also individuals who want to speak about jihad, right? In essence, if you think about that, the Muslims get up in the morning rather than thinking about eating what you call having an omelet and a coffee or tea, that they're also always thinking of jihad, jihad, jihad. That as if every Muslim middle name is jihad or violence. Not that in the past 30 years, if we just take quantifiably, Muslims have been the primary subjects of violence being imposed on them. And as we speak of the war on terror, it is a war of terrorizing communities that have nothing to do with whether it's 9/11 or before. Just remind you that the term Islamophobia was born out of the French colonial legacy in North Africa, much, much earlier than the emergence, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. And more importantly, the question that has to be asked is the United States invaded Iraq under bogus causalities and causing the death and destruction of the Iraqi society. Yet the question of violence is never posed to those who actually have taken our country to war on bogus pretext, caused the death and destruction, and under the rubric of regime change to lay our hands or the hands of the United States on the oil resources. But again, these individuals are in essence attempting to divert from asking the critical questions that need to be asked relative to US policy in the Middle East. Now, Islamophobia, I define it from what I call ethnic studies and decolonial lens. It's a definition that I introduced. Islamophobia is a structural organizing vortex located at the contemporary racial, gender, and class crossroads. It's employed to rationalize and extend the dominant global power hierarchies while embracing a project for silencing the collective global other. In this sense, is thinking of it as a structural organizing tool, rationalizing the continuation of expansion of power dynamics and power hierarchies, and in essence maintain this racialized differences that exist in the world. So it's not surprising that it's an extension of the racial paradigm rather than an elimination of the racial paradigm. And it's organizing our society around these nodes in the same way that anti-communism organized the society in such a way that everything under the sun became connected to the anti-communist epistemic, in the same way that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiments has been deployed as a way to rationalize and extend the dominant global power hierarchy. So it's not surprising, as a result of the war on terror, the United States has bases in 84 countries, and there's an open-ended interventionist approach, not only by the United States, but also Western Europe, NATO, and so on, is an open-ended. So it's a rationalization of expansion and continuation of this dynamic that started much earlier. So this is again part of the dynamic relative to understanding what is Islamophobia and how to actually relate to it. The last definition that I want to also is our colleagues in the UK is what's the All Parliamentary Group on British Muslims definition in 2008. And Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. So again, they linked the understanding of Islamophobia into a type of racism, which is exactly what in many of the discourses that we see, that it's really anti-Muslim sentiment is a type of racism. And we could also go back to the Inquisition period, where the emergence of the particular notions of Europe that was defined around whiteness and also Christianity, in difference to Muslims and Jews, who were deemed to be un-European, and therefore they needed to be expelled. So the expulsion from Europe in order to emerge and birth Europe as a Christian white society intimately was connected with the removal of the other at Europe, in the sense Muslims and Jews, who also happen to be of darker complexion because they're coming from both North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa in this sense, and to become a purely European, or the notions of purity of race. Whiteness was again those who did not mix with Muslims and Jews, which means that even as we think of how the racial theory or the racial demarcation developed between the realm of the human, the realm of subhuman, as Ramon Grasfugel have written and articulated, was crafted around the racial difference with Muslims and Jews, and also was rationalized theologically at this point. So again, it's a very critical, important piece. Now, Islamophobia did not, or at least in the present articulation and the rising tide of racism and discrimination, I actually began the work on Islamophobia in the United States immediately after the 2008 election, or during the 2008 election, immediately thereafter. I witnessed in the first few period of the campaign how the targeting of Obama as a supposed Muslim, and especially as he took office, the emergence of the Tea Party and the birther movement that began before as well as during, and began to utilize Islamophobia as a wedge issue in political campaign. I already said that Islamophobia existed in the United States, and we see it during the Iranian hostage crisis, the writing of Edward Said, but its entry into the public popular discourse around election was crafted around the identity of Obama. So Obama was actually seen and demonized because, or at least on his Muslimness. Let me make this point and make it very clear. People who opposed Obama and rallied against him, they expressed their racism toward him because he's black. So it's his blackness that really produced the visceral reaction, especially among whites, the white segments of our society, the racists, the white supremacists. But at the time in 2008, there still was this notion of still diversity, still that it's not acceptable to say that we despise Obama because he's black. It was convenient or instrumental to use his Muslimness or supposed Muslimness. I said then, and I say it still today, that Obama's Muslimness was a signpost for his blackness. People wanted to use the N-word on Obama, but they felt that the society was not accepting the use of the N-word in the open, so they used the M-word as a signpost for the N-word. And therefore the demonization and targeting of Obama and the whole notion of taking our country back was specifically to try to demonize and not allow the first black president to actually feel restful or comfortable in arriving at the White House. mind you that it was already at a state of bankruptcy because he came to rescue the country at a time of massive economic collapse as a result of the major recession, the financial collapse, and so on. But again, it worked, and those who stoked anti-Muslim sentiments around Obama became the driving in the driver's seat to create the demonization and then to get all of the racists out of the woodwork and feel empowered to come out and rally. So make America great again as a theme was to make America white again, to take our White House, the Charlottesville protest. The White House belongs to us, meaning in an exclusionary way. If you think about the work of all the individuals that were affiliated or associated with the Tea Party and pushed and rode the anti-Obama sentiments and the birther movement, and in essence, they found a welcoming tent for them in the Republican Party. And those who feel shocked about the January 6th assault on the Capitol is like expressing shock after being in a process of continued use of race and racial discourse for quite a long time, going back all the way to the 80s. So when we think about the arrival of Trump, Bannon, Gorka, and Flynn, and their anti-Muslim sentiments, this was a natural conclusion or a natural arrival of a wave that started much earlier. So rather than to think that all these figures were the initiator, I think they were just what you call instrumentalist, utilitarian, knowing how to ride the wave of Islamophobia into power, and with it also to make considerable financial gains in between. So Trump saying Islam hates us, I think Islam hates us in his interview in the CNN was again knowing that there is a power of rallying the base that have already drank and absorbed the Kool-Aid of anti-Muslim sentiment that has been rooted in a racist discourse in this country that goes back deep, right? The deep root of racism, anti-blackness is permanent in there. In essence, everybody cuts their teeth on this phenomenon, all kinds, whether it's explicit or implicit, whether it's direct or indirect, whether innuendos and so on. That is at the foundation of our country, and especially today we're still are witnessing the trial of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the complexity, the entanglements relative to race and racism is there. So saying Islam hates us, knowing it's a nod to the grassroots, to rally people into the election booth to try to vote to take our country back from all those who should not be there and that the country doesn't belong to them. So again, this discourse has a long history for those who study the KKK, the emergence of the KKK in the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, America First, that this is our country, anti-immigrant sentiment, Chinese Exclusionary Act, the anti-union, using corporate power to try to derail, dismantle, and prevent reforms for workers' rights, also opposition to the enfranchisement of women, the suffrage movement, and so on. All this have to be understood as part of a continuum rather than an exception in the contemporary period, which we often will say, well, this is not us. I said, which is us that you're talking about, and what is it that you say it is not us? Have you read the history? Have you read the pain and suffering that continues to be there? And we have not yet, aside from expressing apology to Japanese for the internment, correctly so, during the Reagan period, but so far we have not yet dealt in any serious way, systematic way, with the long and deep legacy and history that is entangled in almost every part of our society. You're talking about from educational institutions to the housing institutions, to the military industrial complex, to the prison industrial complex, to the sport industrial complex. We have not yet begun to even scratch the surface of addressing race and racism, and therefore Islamophobia fitted into this paradigm in a systematic way. So I argue, and again, that Islamophobia is as a new signpost for overt racism, which I maintain created a new rationale for more intense violent racism toward African Americans, Latino, Asians, and minorities in general. It was the acceptability of being overtly racist toward Muslims that emboldened the racists to come out, to think that they actually can hit an old Asian woman in the street, or push an Asian man, or express support for a police officer that puts his knee on a black man for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and think that he is in the right, or individuals who would walk into a church and shoot people. So it's a new signpost. All what you need is to allow people to open the door to express their overt racism, and now they're almost in every corner, and they know the power of mobilizing the racial epistemic. It has a powerful utilitarian function, and those who use it among our political elite, they know that they could slither their way into seats of power and influence using race, racism, and discrimination. Fear is a good commodity for political elites that actually can utilize and deploy to stoke and sow divisions in the society at a moment of crisis. So again, for me, Islamophobia represent this new signposts that are there. So I know I went a little bit longer than the time that I wanted to be with you, but I felt that it's very important for us to delve into the subject in a much more comprehensive way in order to understand, when we say define Islamophobia, what we are dealing with, and to think of it as part of a connected link, a connected phenomena to the foundation of racist otherization discourse, to the long history of anti-Semitism, the long history of anti-blackness, and a long history of targeting minorities in there and marginalized. And what we need is to understand the phenomena and begin to do the heavy lifting of both undoing our own internalized forms of whether it's Islamophobia or internalized form of self-hate, because you begin to what I call putting on yourself fair and lovely cream, so you would become acceptable to those who are demonize you. This is not a phenomena that you could solve by whitening your own skin or whitening your own epistemology. This is something to be confronted. Racism needs to be confronted at the foundation, and it cannot be by trying to act out the epistemology and the understanding of the structure that has been imposed. So again, this is another subject of how to confront it and how to do it, but at the foundation, it is not beautifying yourself is the or using a fair and lovely cream metaphorically is the way to confront racism. In essence, you are accepting to internalize a structure that dehumanizes, otherizes, and completely puts you at the margins of the society. And I think what we need is to reassert our both right to be who we are, but also as a right for us to shape the society in our own vision, worldview, and our horizons, rather than continue to apologize or look the other way in this phenomena. So thank you for being with me today, and I encourage you to access my website, to access my Facebook, as well as to link to my Twitter, Hatem Bayzian at Twitter, and also access this video at YouTube and share it with others. Let's keep the conversation going. Hopefully this has been beneficial to you, and look forward to a continued engagement with you on subject and content that is of critical importance to all of us today. So good evening and Assalamu alaikum, and see you again in the near future.